Okay, my presentation will reflect a little bit now to integrate climate change aspects, climate action to MSP, and how MSP can support climate actions, both in terms of climate adaptation and climate mitigation. Sorry, I need to take. Okay. The link between the two aspects, climate change and MSP, is a link which relates to different aspects. It is very important that as any other plan and program, also the Maritime Expansion Plan are climate proofed. In the sense they are able to incorporate climate change dynamics and climate change challenges into their development, into their context, which also means they contribute. I mean, it first means that the plan itself is climate resilient, but it also means that the plan aims to contribute to the objectives set at the international and European level, which refer to climate change obligation. And of course, the plan itself can provide solutions, and then we will look at some examples later on how to support mitigation and adaptation. Nevertheless, I mean, we must say that although this issue is rather important, and there is also quite ongoing research which is addressing the nexus between climate change and MSP, the climate action is poorly taken in consideration in MSP plans, in former MSP plans, for a number of reasons. Probably maybe because the MSP plans are new themselves, and they struggle into integrating such a complex and overarching aspect. And so we might expect this is going to be definitely one of the topics to be taken and to be addressing in the future and in the second cycle of most of the MSP plans. So going a little bit in more detail, we can say that, I mean, the essence of any MSP plan is to plan activities at sea in a way they do not conflict each other, and they also do not harm, they do not impact the environment. Therefore, taking fully into consideration the needs and the requirements on environmental preservation, environmental protection. When we look at climate change implication, this implies that an MSP plan has to take a future perspective, so help in solving conflicts which can arise among sectors, also from the new challenges posed by climate change effects. One typical example is the one pertaining to fisheries, or the same could be even taken into consideration for aquaculture, due to change in oceanographic conditions, and especially specifically seawater and salinity and temperature of seawater. Fisheries are expected to move, to distribute differently, and as a consequence, also the fishing grounds are going to change in the future, which might determine new conflicts with other pre-existing uses in a given place, or with other or with different fishery within different fishery jurisdictions between different countries. So MSP is expected to solve this kind of problems, and we'll see later on how this can be implemented. At the same time, MSP can help minimizing economic losses due to damage caused by both extreme events and slow onset climate changes modification. Another typical example here is the siting and proper siting and zoning of aquaculture, which has to take into consideration a number of elements, of course, including potential conflict with other uses, potential impacts to the environment, but in a climate change perspective, also the effects of climate change on the environment, which might have consequences on the aquaculture themselves. So it is very important that from a climate change perspective, an MSP try to find that to accommodate properly and activities according to the best characteristics, the best situation the activity can be implemented also in a climate change condition. And of course, as we briefly said before in the presentation of the first slide, maritime spatial planning is expected to consistently contribute to the mitigation of climate change, both by promoting the reduction of emissions and also the increase in carbon sequestration. In the first case, we of course refer to the development of offshore renewable energy installation at sea, and we'll have a look also at a peculiar specific characteristic of this aspect in the Adriatic Sea, which is related to the decommission of obsolete oil and gas platform. While the second is related to the protection of coastal ecosystems. So those kind of ecosystems and habitats that can sequestrate, can store carbon, and therefore act as a sink for carbon in the environment. And here we basically refer to seagrass meadows and salt marshes along the coastal wetlands. You know very well that MSP is a process-based tool, which is adaptive by its nature, and as any kind of other policy process is circular. I mean, there is not really a starting and ending point, as there are different cycles of the process which feed each other. So within the Adriatic project, we ask ourselves where and when we shall consider climate action within the MSP process. And the obvious question is along the entire process. And here you can see a very short summary of actions that shall be implemented in the 5 typical steps or major steps of the MSP process. These steps of the MSP process are taken from the Common Framework for MSP in the Mediterranean, which is a document developed by the UPRAC and the UNEMAP Barcelona Convention System to frame MSP exactly within the system of the Barcelona Convention and in line with the requirements of the ICZM and specifically the ICZM protocol. You can see here that considering the first step in the slide, starting the process and getting organized implies that we clarify since the beginning how MSP can contribute to climate action, in which term adaptation and mitigation are embedded into the MSP process. When we go to the second step, assessing the context, defining the vision, the MSP, this implies that the MSP vision shall, of course, include adaptation and mitigation objectives, and among the others, and looking at and promoting a more resilient marine environment, activities which are adapted to climate change, so climate-proof to new climate change conditions, looking, of course, for the reduction of greenhouse gas emission and improvement of carbon sequestration, as we already said before. Looking at the third step on the analysis of existing and future conditions, is important that when we do analyze the sectors and the marine environment, we also take into consideration current and the future climatic conditions, and concerning the latter, of course, using alternative emission scenarios. Then when we go to the core of the process in defining an MSP plan, it is important that the plan also foresees spatial-based measures and related regulating measures that aim to increase the resilience of maritime sectors and of the marine environment as well, and to contribute to climate change mitigation. And of course, it is quite important that the concept of climate actions is taken also into consideration in the monitoring and evaluation phase of the plan, of the MSP plan. As soon as new climate change knowledge emerge from the scientific literature, from the practicalities, it might be the case if this information is rather important, that this is reflected into an update of the MSP plan. Let me say something about this aspect. Developing an MSP plan is a long and challenging and hard progress. So, of course, updating the plan based on its assessment is quite important, but this has to be balanced against the needed resources, the needed time to really go through another version of the plan. Still in the analysis we performed in the Untitled Chapter, we focused on some of the more typical sectors which characterize the marine environment in the Adriatic Sea, and we selected these six sectors: aquaculture, coastal and maritime tourism, fisheries, marine protected areas, oil and gas, which is quite peculiar. We'll see why in a moment. Shipping of ports. And of course, there are also very strong implications when we look at climate change in terms of land-sea interactions, as some of the climate hazards affecting the sea definitely have effects on land, and on the other way around, some of the hazards affecting the land might also impact the sea and having consequences on some of the maritime activities. Typically, the case can be, for example, an increase in extreme storm events, which can cause damages to coastal infrastructure and which might become a potential source of release of pollutants to the sea. So for each of the sector, what we did was to look at the major climate change impacts and what are the possible adaptation measures that can be implemented through an MSP plan, trying to focusing basically on those that we define spatial-based adaptation measures. So measures that can be really as a primary scope included in an MSP plan. There is a third component of the analysis we did. I didn't include it in the presentation to keep it short. We also highlighted what are some of the mitigation measures that can be promoted through the MSP plans, again, through spatial-based measures. So quite quickly going through the six sectors, if we take aquaculture, we can say that the major impacts are related to changes in sea temperature and salinity, which can affect the abundance and the topology of species that can be farmed in the sea, which has negative, but also might have positive consequences. I mean, it's a matter of selecting the right species for the right place. Then there are indirect impacts, which are related to above direct impacts, which can cause increased diffusion of diseases for the farm species, increased events of harmful algal bloom or hypoxia event, and pollution from increased runoff on land. And of course, in then extreme events like storms or high temperature extreme events can determine loss of production and damage to the infrastructure. So what are the possible measures that can be implemented? Of course, the major one is risk-based zoning inside of aquaculture, which, as I said at the beginning, is also taking in consideration the climate hazards, and therefore looking at those areas that now and in the future will be most suitable for a specific species in terms of aquaculture activity. And there are also new opportunities coming for different species, which might be more adapted to the new conditions, and also this can trigger the commercial exploitation of species which are normally not farmed into the aquaculture installations in the Mediterranean Sea. Then moving to the second sector, which is coastal and maritime tourism, we can say that there are quite a number of impacts that climate change can cause on the sector. Of course, a great component of tourism is attracted by the pristine coastal environment of the Mediterranean Sea and the Adriatic Sea, But we know that coastal areas are particularly vulnerable to flooding and erosion, and sea level rise, and is going to exacerbate these risks. The higher temperature, the increased occurrence and frequency of heat waves, and water scarcity condition will affect and will produce discomforting conditions for during the tourism season, while as indirect effects the pure water quality and the effects on the ecosystem due, for example, the increase in seawater temperature can create degradation of habitats and ecosystem and discourage the fruition of some destinations. But of course, there are even opportunities. The major one is the extension of the summer season, which can lead to diversification of tourist offer, which is something in principle positive, but has to be sustainably managed to avoid that the extension of the tourism season implies the extension of the tourist pressure in other moments of the year in other areas of the Adriatic, and not its division time. There are a number of measures that can be driven by MSP. Of course, the major one is coastal defenses. In this sense, and in particular for the Italian coastline, beach nourishment is particularly important, combined with dune reconstruction, and also when there is a rocky coast with nature-based cliff stabilization. One of the major issues MSP is dealing with is the identification, mapping, and sustainable management of submerged sand deposits. You know that in most of the Italian regions, depending on the quality of the sand, the beach nourishment is made by submerged sand, relict sand deposit, which is very good because this kind of sand deposit have a quality which is very much compliant with that which is required on land, but of course is not free of impacts, both in terms of environmental impacts on biological resources, but also conflict with other uses. And last but not least, it is definitely a finite resource which has to be used in a proper way. So one of the primary role in this respect of the MSP is to provide the way for sustainable use of this kind of resources. Okay, we can move quickly to the other sector, which is fisheries. Similarly to aquaculture, also fisheries can suffer because of changing oceanographic conditions, and which can bring to shift in marine species distribution. Very important in the Mediterranean, but I would say even more in the Adriatic, is the process of meridionalization and tropicalization of marine waters, which respectively mean the increase in species, in the first case coming from the south rim of the Mediterranean, the second case coming from other seas, other oceans, and typically from the Indian Ocean through the Red Sea. So the so-called non-indigenous species diffusion along the entire Mediterranean. What is important to say is that major impacts will be suffered by small-scale fisheries, even called artisanal fisheries, which, because of its structure, is not able to easily relocate its fishing efforts in other areas or in other modalities. So what are the measures that can be implemented through MSP? Of course, we need to know how these species will move in the future. And so modeling and analyzing their future distribution is essential, which will imply providing information which are useful to analyze emerging conflicts with other uses which are in place where the stocks of fish tends to move. There are management strategies that might encourage diversification, in particular, not only multi-species targeting, which means fishing more than one single species, which is typically the case of small-scale fisheries rather than let's call it industrial fisheries, but also try to commercially exploit non-invasive species. There is a very good experience we are looking at in Cyprus, for example. You know that one of the major concern in the Levantine Sea, in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, is in general the invasion of species coming from the Red Sea. Among them, the lionfish or the scorpionfish, which is not only very aggressive, very competing with other species, but also extremely poisonous and for humans. In Cyprus, they are looking at the possibility to use commercially this fish as food for humans, and teaching the local people, the local fishermen, and the local restaurant on how to treat this kind of species. But of course, one of the major solution we have is the establishment of marine protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures, and among them, the most important are the fishery restricted areas that you can see here in this figure, the transnational FRA established between Italy and Croatia in the Jabuka Pomo pit. It is well known when studying now completely recognized the role that protected areas have in restocking fish population also outside the protected areas, and therefore this is definitely one of the measure the MSP can provide for. And this is strictly connected to marine protected areas themselves. There are three major impacts we have identified: the direct impact on coastal ecosystems due to increased flooding, coastal erosion, and some water intrusion. And then again, changing in sea conditions that can favor the diffusion of non-indigenous species, or can determine effects due to seawater acidification with the detrimental effect on biodiversity and therefore on the habitats forming the marine protected areas. The MSP is one of the primary tools that we have to support the designation process of MPAs and other way of conserving marine areas, and also the way of improving their networking. You know that the European Union set a very ambitious target to increase the percentage of marine protected area, or protected area in general, also on land, but we're now considering the sea, up to 30% by 2030. But that's not only the target we shall look at even through the MSP process, because what is even more important is that these areas are effectively and properly managed. We can say that more or less the Mediterranean is already quite close to the 10% target, which is the older target of the biodiversity strategy of the European Union, but is completely lacking behind when we look at properly management of this area in a way that conflicts with human uses are avoided or minimized, for example. Other measures include the extended protection and preservation of coastal ecosystems. We refer here to coastal wetlands, which provide buffering of damages due to climate hazards, such as severe storms, floods, and erosion. And last but not least, the extended protection of salt marshes and seagrasses, which can provide services in terms of carbon sequestration, which are important for mitigation as well. The case of oil and gas is quite peculiar, as I said, because it cannot be only looked at from an adaptation perspective. It must definitely take into consideration primarily a mitigation perspective. So in terms of impacts, the major impacts can be the increased frequency and the intensity of weather events, which can cause damages to the infrastructure, which does not only mean disruption of operation and services, but also risk for human safety and for the environment due to release of pollutants, and which also relate to onshore coastal infrastructure, which are linked to the sector, in particular oil terminals, refineries. But as I said, I think that one of the major aim that MSP shall have in relation to this sector is definitely the one related to the contribution to the decarbonization process, as remarked by all the international European agreement, that should aim for the strong reduction of offshore oil and gas production and support to offshore renewable energy production. Of course, taking into consideration what are the national priorities that might be different from a country to a country. In terms of purely adaptation, this can include the investment in more robust offshore infrastructure and to withstand to more harsh conditions at sea, or to the even relocation of onshore oil terminal refineries in places which are at major risk of flooding or other risks. I briefly mentioned when I start my presentation the specific case of oil and gas infrastructure in the Adriatic Sea. Most of them, and surely for the Italian infrastructure, are quite old and will be decommissioned in the short term. So Italy is thinking how to, of course, decommission this infrastructure. And among the possible solutions, there is also the possible reuse as and for a number of purposes, including the production of renewable energy and the scientific research, environmental protection, and ecotourism. You can see here a paradigmatic experience Italy had, which was due by an accident. That's the Pagura gas platform wreck. That's an old gas platform which collapsed in 60s because of an accident. And after years, of course, it was heavily colonized by sea life species and has become now a Natura 2000 site, which is of extraordinary importance also for marine and maritime tourism. There are around 3,000, 5,000 divers which are allowed to visit the wreck every year, producing so income for the local communities. And that's a type of model that could be looked at and could be implemented through MSP for the other infrastructures that are going to be decommissioned in the future. Okay, last but not least, shipping ports. Again, here the major impacts are expected from extreme events that can damage ports and affect the operations of these infrastructures, with also consequences along the entire logistic chain, which that can reach and then actually can reach the inland quite far away. And again, harsher marine conditions due to stronger storms that can create risk for crews and passengers during navigation and port operation. Here, MSP can do quite a lot. I mean, can propose rerouting of major navigation routes to avoid conflicts with other maritime uses and to avoid the situation where these conflicts are exacerbated by climate change. But we need to take into consideration that the rerouting is quite a long process, and it takes into consideration a lot of trade-off, because any change of route, of optimal route, implies, for example, increase of costs, but even increase of carbon emissions by vessels. MSP can promote the designation of new areas of particular management approach, like the PSSA, which are particularly sensitive sea areas. We have only got one of them in the Mediterranean, which is the Bonifacio Strait between Corsica and Sardinia. Here, the vessels have to apply specific rules, specific technologies to pass through the straits because of its high vulnerability and to avoid collapse, avoid accident with coastal and marine habitats. Or simply, or more simply, is areas to be avoided and traffic separation schemes, and these are already applying, for example, in the northern part of the Adriatic Sea along the route entering the port of Venice in the North Adriatic Sea. And of course, other measures that can be promoted by MSP includes the relocation of seaports and major risk in case the other measures cannot be implemented for the defense. This is the work we basically developed in Adriatic. Now, together with Daria and colleagues in PAPRAC, we are working on a more detailed analysis of climate change implication for MSP. Here you can see a very draft version of what we are doing, and that we still will work on this in the rest of the year. So for each of the sector and subsector, we are detailing expected climate change impacts, providing a short description, and then defining what could be what the MSP objectives for the sector related to climate change can be, and then provide a possible list of adaptation measures. And for the measures, this is not visualized here in the slide because the table is longer. We also do provide evidence of multiple benefits other than adaptation. I mean, if we do preserve a seagrass meadow, this has, of course, also important benefits for biodiversity, as an example. And what are the benefits for mitigation? We are also considering a longer list of sectors here, and this is going to be transformed at the end of the process into a tool that PAPRAC will make available to users. Thank you very much. That was my last slide of the presentation.